So the use of a stored procedure allows you to control how data enters and leaves your database, and it kind of gives you the ability to provide a layer of abstraction over things like inserts, updates, deletes, and even selects. Just as a basic example, say you had one table and you had to insert some values into that table. Well, naturally, if you were writing an application like a C# program to insert data into that table, you could just write an insert statement for that, take your values and insert them directly into the table. If you were to build a stored procedure, that stored procedure could serve that same purpose of inserting that data into the table. It would take in the values that you wanted to add as parameters, and then it would actually have inside the body of the stored procedure the insert statement. Now, where the stored procedures start to bring value is that same stored procedure can be the same regardless of what the inner workings of the database and how those may change. So when you're dealing with things like inserts and updates and deletes, you're kind of dealing with the raw materials of a database. If you're writing data to a table, the insert is the way to do it. Updates the same way. But you don't have control over validation of the data going into that database table. So for example, if you have a start date and an end date column in your table, you wanted to make sure that your start date is always before your end date. You can't really validate that with its insert statement on its own. But if you had a stored procedure that took in the start date and end date, you could then check those two parameters to make sure that the start date is before the end date, and if not, you can throw an error. Much the same way with insert statements like that, you may at some point realize that for better normalization of your data, that you need to take that one table that you're inserting into and actually break it into 2 or 3 tables. With the stored procedure, you can revise the procedure's body and change it so that the data that's being inserted can actually be inserted in order into table A, then B, then C. But the stored procedure itself would still be the same call, and it would still take in the same parameters. So as a software developer, if there were database changes that needed to be made, those database changes could be made, the stored procedure could be revised, but the software that's calling the stored procedure would not need to change. And that's the big advantage that you have with stored procedures, is that they become a layer of abstraction that actually hide the base database functionality from the rest of the application. So there's definitely a big advantage of using them in that way, so that way you can maintain control over how does my application work and things like that, and then still have the liberty to make changes to the database without having to go and revise the software that may be utilizing that database. So stored procedures really provide you a lot of control over, here's what I'm expecting for input parameters for an insert or update. Gives you the ability to validate those input parameters, and then likewise perform the necessary actions in the order that they need to be done without relying on maybe a software developer or even yourself writing it in code somewhere else to make sure that all the pieces are going in the right way, in the right order. So that's definitely the one main thing that I would say about stored procedures, that they definitely give you that level of control.